Hello, everyone. Depending on which time zone you're joining us from today, a very warm good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. I'm Vinika Rao, and it's a real pleasure to have you all with us for this very important discussion on unearthing the roots of systemic racism. The ramifications of the movement against racial discrimination that started in May of this year in the United States continue to manifest across the globe. It's becoming increasingly clear that dislodging deep-seated racism is going to require comprehensive and long-term strategic effort, as well as effective and sensitive leadership from our heads of policy, business, and education. Institutes of higher learning, like INSEAD, that help to shape the leaders of tomorrow have a special role to play in this regard. For a proper understanding of the problem, it becomes important to take a look at the origins of systemic racism and its modern day implications. And that's what we're seeking to do with this webinar today. It's my pleasure now to introduce you to our opening speaker, Professor Peter Zemsky, Deputy Dean, Dean of Innovation, and the Eli Lilly Chaired Professor of Strategy and Innovation at INSEAD. Peter, over to you.
Very good. Actually, I have to, okay, good. I want to start by thanking you all for coming out for what Vinika says rightly is really a very important topic. I could say of our time, but it's been with us for a long time, unfortunately. I really think for all individuals and organizations that are committed to the fair and just treatment and outcomes for all members of global society, it's clear that we're falling short in some important ways. I think it's important to acknowledge as we get into the discussion that this is a hard topic. I think at some level, probably everybody on this call at least have internalized that racism is not okay at least at an intellectual, moral level. But ironically, that can actually make it harder to sort of honestly challenge ourselves and our organizations about how we might be falling short. For me personally, I spent the first half of my life in the US, and I've used this moment to reflect some on how that's actually impacted my own experience of race, especially around those of African descent. What I wanted to do at the beginning of the call is to talk a little bit about why this is specifically important and relevant for INSEAD. Again, it's of general importance, but I think particularly for INSEAD. First of all, the core of the DNA of INSEAD for me is around diversity. Really that we really push ourselves, we try and personify respect for diversity. And what does that mean in practice? Well, remember, INSEAD was originally all about transcending national differences and building meaningful connections with people from different cultures to allow for the joint pursuit of business opportunities. And over time, we've broadened that: gender, race, intellectual diversity. But if you go back to that essence, that we're committed to diversity as building real human connections to allow everyone to pursue economic and business gain, this is really the antithesis of systemic racism, right? Which is unfortunately about a collective dehumanizing to some extent of certain minority groups that leads them to be excluded from opportunity. And as often happens in society and business, these things get to be self-perpetuating. We know the origins of this, but clearly today, as some groups don't have economic success, that can reinforce these perceptions and we get stuck in that. So for me, I think the key thing for INSEAD is how can we really bring the best of what INSEAD is about in terms of empathy with each individual, the ability to connect across differences, respect for everyone, to what's going to be, let's be honest, a difficult challenge of breaking this negative feedback that holds certain minority groups back. The other thing I would say is this is very relevant for our commitment to business as a force for good, obviously, but in some subtle ways as well. Obviously one of the big things we are trying to tackle is issues around inequality and access. And we know that there's an urgency here. Digitalization, for example, is leading to more unequal outcomes. And when you interact this with racism, where certain groups don't have access to these big new opportunities and are more exposed to the precariousness in the digital economy, it really questions, I think, a lot of people's confidence in the current system in ways that we need to address. And this has only been amplified by COVID, right? It's not an accident, I think, that COVID and Black Lives Matter come out a little bit at the same time. Finally, my fast thought for INSEAD would be that in subtle ways, I think an international and multicultural perspective can help. Being able to step out of your own culture and take a look at the way racism plays out could be helpful. Again, for myself, just introspection, I notice that the way I experience race is actually, or learn to, is different when I'm in the US than say when I'm in France. And those are perspectives we can bring. So again, thank you everyone for tuning in to this really important conversation for INSEAD and global society. I'm sure you'll find the session really enlightening. I encourage all of you to be open to being intellectually and emotionally challenged by the speakers today. Back to you, Vinica.
Thank you very much, Peter, for opening the discussion and setting the stage for the conversation to come, and especially for giving us a sense of how important this issue is to us at INSEAD. My pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker for today. We have with us Professor Felicia Henderson. Felicia is adjunct professor at CS Pro and a well-known leadership consultant. She's also one of our own and an alumna from our EMCC course. Felicia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vinica. Thank you, Peter. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining today. I'll start with what should be a simple statement. Can you please go back to the prior slide? Stay on the title slide, thank you. So I'll start with what should be a simple statement. Black Lives Matter. This statement is more than a protest slogan. It's an invocation of a long denied truth, an affirmation in the face of a reality that constantly sends the opposite message. And so let's look at this reality in the US today on the next slide now, please. So we see here 4 unequal outcomes, each of which actually represents a much more complex story. First, African Americans suffer higher unemployment rates than whites. Now, historical Bureau of Labor statistics show that the overall unemployment rate for African American workers is typically twice as high as the rate for white workers. An unemployment gap exists at each education level, high school, college, postgraduate. The COVID-related economic disruption closed this gap a bit by driving unemployment rates up for all workers. But recent Bureau of Labor statistics show that the tentative recovery that was observed in May benefited white workers, while the unemployment rate went up for African Americans. Next, we see that the rate of obtaining, nope, still on the same slide. We see that the rate of obtaining at least a bachelor's degree by age 25 is higher for whites than for African Americans. 35% for whites and 21% for African Americans in 2016. This gap was significantly higher before 1960, so perhaps we could say that there's some progress. But what these numbers don't show is that a college degree brings fewer financial benefits for African Americans than for whites. It does not provide as much protection from unemployment. It does not result in the same salary or wealth boost, and it comes with more student debt. White families headed by a person with some college have slightly more wealth than African American families headed by a person with a graduate or professional degree, such as an MBA. Still on the same slide, the next data point shows differences in home ownership, with 73% of whites owning their primary residence, while only 45% of African Americans do. I'm going to say a bit more about housing later. So let's look at overall wealth, the final data point here. You see a stark wealth gap between whites and African Americans. The median net worth for white families is about $171,000, while for African American families, it's about $17,600. Now, looking at negative or zero net worth, about 1 in 10 families have zero or negative net worth, while about 1 in 5 African American families fall into this category. Now, this is only a sampling of the numerous unequal outcomes related to livelihood. And racial inequality is not limited to education, unemployment, and financial wealth. Let's now look at the next slide. So we see here, again, a very small sample of the numerous unequal outcomes here relating to criminal justice, to civil and political rights, and to health. The circle to the right, showing that African Americans have a rate of hospitalization for COVID-19 5 times higher than that of whites, brings together a number of inequalities, including disparities in living conditions, access to transportation, prevalence in low-wage so-called essential jobs, access to health care, frequency of underlying health conditions, and even bias in the medical profession. Now, it would take several webinars to examine all the data about racial inequality in modern American society. But what I hope I've conveyed with these 2 brief slides is the pervasiveness of racial inequality, with consistently and often intertwined unequal outcomes affecting all areas of life. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, if you are convinced, or if you can be convinced, that unequal outcomes on the basis of race are both prevalent and persistent, the question becomes, what's going on? And there are 2 possible outcomes. There's something about the behaviors and attitudes, and dare I say, the traits of African Americans that yields unequal outcomes. And this explanation is sometimes referred to as the Black culture or Black development argument. Alternatively, there's something about the ways that society treats African Americans that generates these unequal outcomes. And this explanation is sometimes referred to as the discrimination or systemic racism argument. Now, each explanation has fervent proponents, and some advocate for a middle ground. While elements of the argument that focuses on supposed African American shortcomings may be true, in my own view, it's both futile and cruel to rely primarily or solely on explanations and solutions that charge individuals with personal responsibility of lifting themselves out of the deep hole that's been created by centuries of deliberate marginalization. So let's look at this history of state-sponsored marginalization and the continuing manifestation of systemic racism. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, as Peter alluded to, I am aware that many of you are uncomfortable hearing me use the terms white and African American, that in many countries it's taboo to talk about race. Now, as you've probably guessed from my own accent, I am American. And as Professor David Roediger has said, the world got along without race for the overwhelming majority of its history. The US has never been without it. Now, what Roediger means is that the concept of race, the social construction, has been an integral part of US society from the early days of European colonization. So let's start by understanding the construction of whiteness as a social identity. The idea that they were white people developed among Englishmen as they began to interact with darker-skinned indigenous people in the East Indies. And they used this term white or white people to refer to people who looked like them. Whiteness as a social invention was used to separate European colonists from the East Indians, and white skin color began to be associated with civilized men as compared to the Indians, whom they viewed as savages. Now, from the mid-1600s, this notion of whiteness as an elevated social and legal status started to be combined with the word race. Could we see the next slide, please? So the ideas of race as a category and whiteness as a privileged category took on increased importance for Europeans as they began to consider how best to exploit the riches of the American continent. The supposedly unclaimed land could allow for agriculture on a much larger scale than had been practiced in Europe. Additionally, the types of crops, sugarcane, tobacco, cotton, that could be grown in these warmer climates were attractive commodities. But to develop plantations on a sufficient scale to make these sea voyages profitable, European colonists needed agricultural labor and know-how. Now, from a human standpoint, the European diseases and violence that decimated the Native Americans was an absolute atrocity. From a business standpoint, it was a setback. It meant that colonial planters would need to import labor. And so with their eyes on the bottom line, the European companies, and here I should pause to remind us that colonial ventures were large companies, often holding monopolies that were granted by royal decree. So these European companies developed a new business model that instead of relying on native labor, relied on imported labor. The Portuguese and Spanish had already established trade routes to Africa and between Africa and the Americas. The triangular trade involved providing manufactured goods to African trading partners in exchange for gold, spices destined for Europe, and beginning in the early 1500s, enslaved people destined for the American colonies. Now, according to historians, Africans were more attractive than European indentured servants, not simply because of the cost savings. Africans also brought skills in farming, carpentry, and metal and leather working that could boost production in the Americas. So as the British, the Dutch, and the French saw the economic potential, a literal trade war developed, with Royal Navy ships often escorting the commercial ships that were transporting these valuable commodities and enslaved people across the Atlantic. The numbers of African people transported in bondage to the Americas doubled each year, each 50-year period from 1600 to 1750. And between 1750 and 1850, Europeans enslaved approximately 7.5 million African people, which was well over half of the 12.5 million people, the total for the entire Atlantic slave trade. Now, what was going on in the thought life of Europe during this time, 1600 to 1850? Could we see the next slide now, please? So the rise of the transatlantic slave trade corresponds to the age of enlightenment. And as Enlightenment thinkers began to consider natural laws and natural rights, a race-based justification for enslaving Africans began to develop. Many of Europe's most recognized Enlightenment thinkers, many theologians, adhered to a new social hierarchy based on human races. So with the construction of blackness as a category that was not simply inferior, but subhuman, colonizers and enslavers had moral license to subjugate Africans because, according to this belief system, it was simply the natural order of things. And this natural order, this race hierarchy, is the invention or construction of anti-blackness. So let's look at the next slide to see how anti-blackness became codified in the Americas. Now, before I look at specific laws, let's think about how law interacts with people's behaviors and beliefs. So most obviously, law has a regulatory or deterrent function. It tells us what we are permitted to do or what we are required to do and what we must refrain from doing. It also provides consequences that will suffer for violating the law. But legal philosophers argue that law also has an expressive function. So law may change social norms directly, the idea being that if enough individuals obey the law out of simple respect or fear, their changed behavior shifts social expectations about what behaviors are acceptable. Now, at a deeper level, some argue that law affects internalized individual values and beliefs, not simply behaviors. Individuals may use law as a signal about societal values and attitudes, and through various mechanisms, change their own deeply held beliefs and values to adjust to this signaling. So with this idea of law as a signal, let's now look at early slave codes in the Americas on the next slide, please. So you see in this image the preamble to the Barbados Slave Code, where the racial hierarchy and anti-Black beliefs that I referred to earlier are incorporated fully and transformed into law. In this preamble, Black slaves are described as barbarous, wild, and savage. And this subhuman nature is used to justify a new set of laws, meaning laws that are different from those governing European servants who were covered by a separate code. The slave code developed a system of chattel slavery, meaning that Black enslaved people were legally property, not persons. They did not benefit from the human rights attaching to personhood, again, because of the subhuman status attached to Blackness. Slave codes had two main purposes: to protect white property rights and to protect white lives. So provisions such as those allowing lashing and branding and even slitting the nose of enslaved persons, as well as provisions granting impunity to whites who killed Blacks in the course of so-called extreme correction, were designed to convey the belief that Blacks were not human. Provisions such as those preventing enslaved persons from gathering, from traveling without written permission, or from striking a white person, even in self-defense, conveyed the idea that Blacks were dangerous, if not adequately controlled. So the Barbados Slave Code served as the precedent for slave codes throughout the British colonies, including the colonies that became the United States. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the North American colonial project was built squarely on the foundations of white supremacy and anti-Blackness that had been developed by Europeans to enslave millions of Africans. Unfortunately, time will not permit to look at every legal and social tool the colonists used to implant racism into US law and society. I'll briefly touch on two or three. Could we see the next slide, please? So the US Declaration of Independence reflected the Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality, but the US law reflected the Enlightenment categorization of people into so-called natural categories. The institution of slavery and white Southern property rights, their ownership of other human beings, were preserved and protected by the new federal constitution. And the state laws in the Southern states continued to refine the slave codes. Zoe and I mentioned certain provisions in our article, so I'm going to focus on some others that we did not have space for there. Now, all slave codes contain provisions that banned the education of enslaved persons. Again, these provisions serve the two purposes of protecting property and protecting white lives. Keeping enslaved people from learning to read or write supported the idea that Blacks were unintelligent, a primary justification of chattel slavery, and more practically, it prevented enslaved people from reading pamphlets that began to question the morality of slavery as abolition movements grew. And it prevented them from forging travel documents that they could use to escape from slavery. Now, as to safety, whites feared that educated Blacks could organize and revolt. Many states, in fact, tightened their anti-literacy laws following the revolt led by Nat Turner in 1831, during which 50 white people were killed in the conflict launched by enslaved people seeking their freedom. Now, the stigma of intellectual incompetence created by these anti-literacy laws and artificially suppressed literacy rates attached, this stigma of incompetence remains today. The study I cite here suggests that this stigma is so pervasive that it even affects, to use the author's words, well-intentioned liberal whites. These are whites who are inclined towards social policies that favor African Americans. In seeking to connect with African Americans, whites who identified as liberal adjusted their word usage in what the study authors refer to as a competence downshift. They alter their verbal responses in a way that matches anti-Black stereotypes and presumption of less competence. Could we see the next slide, please? So in 1862, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation declaring that as of January 1st, 1863, all enslaved persons in the rebelling states would then, thenceforth, and forever be free. Once all enslaved persons were finally legally emancipated, Southern planters were faced with the challenge of continuing their business activities without this previously coerced and free labor. It's also important to note that emancipation did not overturn 2 centuries of anti-Black racism. So rather than adjust their business practices or their business plans to account for the new reality of African-American freedom, Southerners instead adjusted the law to create a system that has been described as slavery by another name. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to invite you to do a bit of homework by researching the Jim Crow laws, if you're not already familiar with them, and also the so-called pig laws. I'll focus quickly on a set of laws called vagrancy laws. These laws criminalized unemployment and homelessness. And you see unemployment in quotes here because it referred not only to joblessness, but also to idleness or unproductivity as viewed and defined by whites. Now, many newly free people took to the roads to get as far away from plantations as possible. Walking without fixed destination was vagrancy. Others took time to search for family members from whom they had been separated by the intra-American slave trade. This too was defined as vagrancy. And vagrancy was punishable by forced labor, and in a modification to the laws that had previously applied to white laborers, vagrancy was punishable by being chained and shackled. So the signals of these laws are fairly obvious, and you can find posters that campaign against freedmen bureaus with a derogatory image of a Black man lazing idly. And these associations with idleness continue to underlie anti-Black stereotypes. You have a study reference here as well. Can we go to the next slide quickly? So finally, as I mentioned, there was discrimination in housing. I want to cover this just very quickly because I need to emphasize that anti-Black racism is not limited to the American South. The Federal Housing Administration, which was created as part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, promising to pursue real equality for all citizens, this Federal Housing Administration actually adopted an underwriting manual which forced segregation. It in fact said that races should not live together and drove a practice referred to as redlining. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to have to invite you to do a little bit of homework. But redlining essentially created a situation where African Americans could not obtain mortgages, and certain neighborhoods were essentially uninsurable for purposes of mortgage underwriting. You see the signaling by the law here, and this rather interesting study that is cited suggests that this stigma attached not just to Black people, but to Black spaces. Can we go to the final slide?
Felicia, my apologies. Just a quick request to...
It's the final slide, Benica. I'm just going to pop up these 3 takeaways, and we're ready for Q&A or for the panel.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So you see here that racial inequity is not an accident. It's part of a system that was designed to marginalize to marginalize Blacks and in consequence, African Americans. I think Peter has made some of these points quite ably. I'll just go to the final point and point you to the work of a great scholar, Ibram Kendi, who suggests that we cannot be not racist. We actually have to be anti-racist. So Vinica, that's it for me. And if I'm happy to go straight to the panel if we, unless there are questions.
Not at all. Yes. Thank you so much, Felicia. So much to learn and understand from what you've shared. And I think we'll take a very quick, 2 minutes for questions just as a follow-up to the presentation. And yeah, I'm sure you'll keep your answers brief. So I had a very basic, very fundamental question to ask you, which was about, when we talk about race, what are we really talking about? And we had a question from Jacques, one of our listeners, who spoke about, how does race as a concept impact systemic racism? So what exactly does race mean?
So race is a social construct. And what we mean by that is that it is an artificial human invention. It is, I was going to say it's a useful category, but it is a category that has been used to create certain rights and to deny certain rights. And so that's what we're referring to, is this artificial construction that unfortunately continues to impact the lived experiences of people who are placed into specifically non-privileged categories in very detrimental ways.
Thank you indeed. So I will now go straight into the panel so that we can have some additional perspectives, both from the business world as well as from academia, and some very interesting people to bring in. And of course, I'll continue to ask questions to Felicia too. So feel free to send in your questions for Felicia in the panel. So my pleasure now to introduce our other speakers for this evening. We have with us Professor Zoe Kinias. Zoe is the Academic Director of INSEAD's Gender Initiative and Area Chair and Associate Professor of Organizational Behavior. She's also the co-author of an important paper that Felicia referred to earlier on the topic of systemic racism. Welcome, Zoe. We also have with us Marlon Bowman, who's one of our alumni also. He's the head of customer experience, employee benefits at the First National Bank in South Africa. And I should mention that Marlon is also the father of a 13-week-old baby. So a very special thank you to Marlon for making time to be with us today. And we also have with us Professor Emmett Tracy, who is the Dean of the African Leadership University School of Business. Emmett is also the Executive Vice President of Academic Affairs at ALU. Emmett, wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you, Venica.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'm going to quickly take a set of questions to each of you and also try and cover some of the interesting questions that are coming in from the audience. Over to you first, Zoe. I wanted to ask you now, Felicia's presentation, of course, focused primarily on the US, on America. But we know, of course, that this is not a problem that's restricted to any one continent or any one nation. And in fact, in the article that you both co-authored, and I quote from there, you mention the sense of systemic racism resonates in the experiences of people on every inhabited continent. So can you elaborate on the global ramifications of this issue, please?
Thank you for asking, Venica, and thank you again, Felicia, for sharing your insights with us today. Really, when we say every inhabited continent is affected by this, we have to start by bearing in mind what Felicia was sharing about the fact that 3 continents were involved in the creation of the system in the United States. This was, Europe was intricately involved, Africa was a part of this story, being exploited as well as North America and Latin America as well. So really, in some ways, 5 continents, although we've been focusing on those 3. So we've already got many of the continents involved in the story. But then what's also happened is the fact that the media that is consumed globally is largely coming out of the United States. Our entertainment, our news, we get a lot, our education. The United States is very influential. And therefore, the systemic creation that Felicia was talking about, the social construction of race, has been fed to the whole world. And it's very interesting that we maybe don't challenge so much. Many people are consuming these media representations without much thought even given to them. So we may not feel that that's the case, but it can still be happening.
Thank you for that. And staying with this, the global ramifications, Marlon, if I can ask you now, you live and work in South Africa now. Of course, you've lived elsewhere before. So perhaps share with us a little bit about how you see this systemic racism, manifesting in South Africa and other countries that you've worked in.
Great. Thank you, Venica. And thank you, Felicia. I think that was really great history of the United States. I think maybe the first thing to comment on is we're a country that has grappled with this for many years. Our first legislation on this very topic came through in 2003, and a country that is 85% Black. We talk, and I think maybe I'm a good example for this as a young corporate South African, but we talk about our companies looking like Oreo cookies. They're Black on the front line, and then there are incentives for them being Black in the boardroom, so there's a little bit of Black there, and in between, the filling is white. And I think if there's something that I've learned from the South African lesson is I think people occasionally want to vilify racism as something evil that happened somewhere else. So it's easy to vilify the South African white people and say that they are different to the European whites and they are different to the American whites. My experience is not that. My experience is that even the best, most liberal thinking white people have these biases ingrained in them, but they've been taught to think of racism as something so viciously toxic that to bring that topic up makes you run the risk of being the evil Black guy in the room. And so as a result, as Black people moving through corporates in South Africa, and I think when I think of my friends and my people I call my brothers and sisters, we are a very assertive generation. We will not go quietly. But we are also very aware that we kind of have to if we want to keep our jobs. So there's this real tricky balance for us. And inevitably, how I've kind of internalized it is I probably have to accept that my career is on a longer curve. I may be more talented than the rate at which the promotions I get will possibly come through. because I have to balance this thing of being true to myself and these convictions and being proud of my Blackness, while at the same time realizing that to be too assertive with it in white spaces is going to other me and hurt me. I hope that answers the question a bit.
Indeed, and thank you for being so candid and sharing something that's clearly coming from the heart. Emmett, if I can move to you now, we've had a previous conversation about the African education system currently, and of course, this is something that you understand very well. And you've mentioned to me previously about how you've always felt that the African system of education, higher education too, is inherited. It's inherited from the West. Now, is there almost perhaps an element of covert systemic racism in the continuing omission of bringing in more sort of truth in terms of African philosophy, African ethos into its own education system, even in the current day?
Yeah, Vinika, thank you, and Felicia, thank you for presentations. It was enlightening and definitely helps to contextualize the conversation about a curriculum. I think it's true, if you look at academics and you look at a curriculum, especially on the continent, and I'll focus there as where I work and in my experience. And even if you look at business curriculum, you're really talking about a narrative that perpetuates, consciously or unconsciously, a culture of discrimination. So as a colleague from INSEAD might say, curricular narratives can come down to storytelling. And the story that's being told often on the continent has inherent gaps. Right? It often lacks a diversity and it often lacks a perspective of Africa itself. So an example that you give of philosophy, in business ethics, we might talk about, may go back and talk about Kant, or you may talk about Heidegger, but you're certainly not addressing often enough a concept of Ubuntu. Or you're not talking about thinkers like Zara Yacob, if you go back centuries, or you think about Anton Amo, or even Aimé Césaire. So you're really, all in all, the engagement with diversity is missing, I think, comprehensively in the curriculum. And so the full story is not really being told. Right? So it's no secret that the education system on the continent is an inherited one. I think the critical part to understand is that our inheritance is limited. Right? It's not telling the full story. And so part of our job now in 21st century is to really look at, how we can ensure that those stories are really making it into the curriculum and those stories are being told.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And, I was reading a number of our audience questions that have come in, very interesting ones there. Felicia, one question to you first. We have spoken in the past, on the fact that women who were enslaved had a particularly difficult experience. Often they were considered more valuable, unfortunately, for the worst possible reasons, and hence had a harsher experience even than the men. Now, staying with the implications of gender and coming to the modern day, can you talk to the experiences of Black women who now have this double whammy, the intersection of race and gender? How does that manifest today?
So that's a challenging question. It manifests in so many ways. I was just actually sharing yesterday with Zoe an article about the feminist movement, or what many Black feminists refer to as the white feminist movement, because Black women are frequently excluded from movements that speak for various social identities. So I think Zoe and I have a link in our article to the Say Her Name movement. The killings of African-American women frequently go unnoticed or underreported. They don't trigger the same outrage as the very heavily publicized killings of Black men. And African-American women or Black women are also excluded from the feminist movement, which advocates for rights that are of interest to white women. And so this double exclusion, this double stigmatization actually comes at quite a cost for African-American, or for, I should speak, I can't speak for all Black women, I'm speaking as an African-American woman. And I will say that Marlon has talked about trying to shape himself into white spaces. you have African American women trying to shape themselves into white and male spaces, which comes at a significant cost to the types of behaviors that are going to be permitted, the types of emotions that can be expressed, even down to appearance. Just a simple anecdote, I'm presenting on systemic racism today and spent half an hour straightening my hair. So, this sort of ultimate internalization of norms about what it is to be professional.
Indeed, and I'm sure there are, a whole lot of personal experiences that everyone on the panel can share, who've experienced this. So yes, and appreciate your sharing that. Now, Zoe, one of the things that comes up, and this is also audience questions are coming up on this, when we talk about racism, the concept of how to actually recognize racial discrimination. And you're smiling, I know, because you have research on this before. We all have different mental models of racism based on our experiences, based on what we've heard and learned. But tell us from what the research that you've done, what leads people to recognize racial discrimination?
Thank you for the question, Vinica. So there's so many complexities involved in the recognition of racial discrimination. And we nerdy scientist types think of these as falling into two categories of really being cognitive, which are based on what we've observed, what we've seen, what we've been taught, that Emmett was talking about again, the mental models, and does a situation that we observe or that we encounter match those mental models? Now, the other part of this story is that these aren't necessarily cold cognitions, in the sense that we have an emotional response. They can affect our feelings that we are people of worth today. And as our other panelists have spoken to, nobody wants to be a bad person. Nobody wants to be that racist person. And so because there's such a desire to not see ourselves that way, even to the extent that we have internalized these negative representations. We have internalized the systemic barriers that people who are African and of African descent face. We don't want to see that, and so that makes it harder for us to see it. Now, I'll just say very quickly about my research because I want to hear from the other panelists as well. But what we find is that because of this self-threat that happens for white people with respect to recognition of racism, to the extent that people can be reminded that they are generally people of worth, self-affirmations such as being reminded of our core personal values, being reminded of how we behave and what we are like when we are the best versions of ourselves, can help us to acknowledge racism when we at least have someone explaining it to us in the way that Felicia was today. So it really is a combination of learning and then also getting past that potential self-threat.
Indeed, yes, thank you. And we have a comment from Tabo in the audience who talks about this and, saying how many people say we don't see color, and this is possibly a lie and insincere. So absolutely, thank you for sharing that. Moving now to, and please, all of you feel free to jump in as you think you have something that you'd like to say on this, but perhaps particularly to Marlon and Emmett now. You're our younger professionals, you're the future leaders of tomorrow. So what do you see as the crucial elements of the solution then to counter racial discrimination? What would you like to see your generation of leaders doing in this regard? And are there any intervention approaches that you've seen, for instance, that have worked very well, so that we start talking now more about the solution that we hope to see?
Well, I guess, Emmett, if you're comfortable, I'll take a swing first, and I guess we can go from there.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So if I reflect on that question, I try and play quite an active role in mentoring younger Black professionals through the world. And I think one of the biggest things that happens is in your mid-20s, when you come out and start thinking you're invincible, you move into these corporate areas and you start realizing that corporate success is a function of sponsorship and a function of network. Corporate decision makers are risk averse. and they are trying to make the lowest risk decision to keep getting that target in. And eventually that leads to them finding more people who look and talk like them. So when I talk to these aspiring professionals, I talk about how are you going to build that network, or how and how do you build trust with people across these lines. But again, I think to come back to Felicia's point, that puts the burden on the person who doesn't have the power to try and change the situation. And that's where it gets very tricky. So when I think about it from the other perspective, I think the one thing that I find the toughest to take about the recent declarations of companies is no one's putting it in the targets. It has to hit someone's pocket. If it doesn't hit someone's pocket, it won't work. My country is proof of that. Wherever they made it hit the pocket, that place got slightly blacker. So I think that for me is I think the first piece is it has to hit senior people's targets, and it has to hurt their wallets. The second thing for me is help Black people grow these networks. Help them grow these networks. So one of my favorite examples is Google does a really great example of it, and they have a special event for all of the Black employees of Google. They all fly to San Francisco, and it becomes so important because it's that ability to traverse whiteness, whether you're South African white or European white, that gets you to go to Amsterdam when someone offers the job. So, and often what I think people try and do is they think, well, if I put Black people in those same spaces with everyone else, well, that connection is going to happen the same way. I think you have to think about it from the Black perspective. And I think what that means is, one, there's no gap. There's no way that you can compensate for a lack of representation. And the way that representation manifests down the chain is so important. So grow that chain of Black people through your organization. Because what happens is Black people feel they need to compromise in themselves to get into the white person's network. And then they start keeping little pieces of themselves behind. And that just starts a whole spiral that eventually, if I've got to use 10 or 15% of my brain to keep track of all the things that I can't do, and you're using 100% of your brain to just be good at work, my chances of winning are just not as high. And so for me, it's always, when I come back to it, I think of those two things specifically: targets and networks.
Yeah, I'll follow, Vinika, I'll follow on that. I agree with that completely. I think in the education sector, again, especially on the continent, but really, in some ways globally, the role of senior administrators in education is definitely on the top of mind. Should be hiring. I think if you still look at the recent statistics from AACSB, the percentages of faculty who represent people of color is extremely low, right? So there's just not that representation even at the front of the classroom, and that makes the whole conversation about racism and moving forward difficult, because you're perpetuating some of the issue by the lack of diversity there. Second would be the support. So understanding your student body, and if you're a student body that maybe a minority representation, there's no doubt that there are other challenges that you're facing in that institution, and whether you're conscious of them or unconscious of them, they're real, and there needs to be that investment in support for that community. The third is I'll bring up is a more sensitive subject, but it's even I think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about it, which is about even just the relationship between educational institutions globally and the continent. You're talking about a history, as Felicia went through, a history of slavery, a history of colonialism, and a history of extraction. It's a painful history, but much again, if that is perpetuated today. So when many institutions think about how they want to diversify or gain an African perspective in their communities, they talk about going and recruiting African students and bringing them to other countries. And basically you're talking about a brain drain in many sorts, right? So there's a huge issue there. And our group, ALU, is in ALA, which is a secondary level institution, African Leadership Academy in Joburg. We were part of that, right? And for a long time, we were educating, incredibly talented young men and women who were, 16 to 18 years old. And we were so proud of how we were sending them to Stanford and Harvard and Oxford. But then we sort of realized, wait a minute, we're active participants in an issue and a problem. And so that's where sort of the university itself really came, to be, was we recognized that, we needed to not perpetuate a similar pattern of extraction, so to speak, which is still a major issue on the continent. Whether, really up and down the continent. So just kind of for educational institutions, just to keep those kind of perspectives in mind on, the hiring that's going on, the support for the student body, and then even their approach to the continent and their approach to diversification can sometimes be problematic, even if it's unconscious.
Thank you. And, obviously there's a lot more that we can hear from all of you and learn from all of you, but I want to keep some time for our closing address today. So I want to say a big thank you to all of our panelists for having made the time to be with us and some very insightful sharing. And also a note to say a big thank you to our audience who are sending the most interesting questions, as well as some very insightful and heartfelt comments. So thank you for that. And it's my pleasure now to welcome to give his closing address on this topic, Professor Ilian Niehoff, Dean of INSEAD. And if I can first maybe perhaps ask all our panelists to say goodbye at this point, and if I can ask Ilian to, yes, come back on. And yes, so Professor Ilian Niehoff, Dean of INSEAD, the Rousing Chair Professor of Economic and Business Transformation, does not need any introduction, but I have to do that. Ilian, over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vinica. And I want to thank the panelists for participating in our first webinar on this issue. I think that it's a super important topic. It's an important topic for the school and for the world. To be completely honest, I think that at INSEAD, it is easy to be complacent. It is easy to refer to our amazing diversity in terms of number of nationalities, people coming from all over the world. I mean, even I was thinking, about a month ago, my daughter studies at Princeton, and she was saying, Princeton had their first Black valedictorian for the first time in the history, 250 plus years of history at Princeton. And I was thinking, you know what? I think in the last 5 years, we have like 3 Black valedictorians, including Marlon. And I still remember, his absolutely moving speech about, trying to find, the better version of ourselves. And I think that's what we need to do now. We need to forget our complacency, and we need to look deep inside INSEAD and see how actually we can have a better version of INSEAD in this dimension. So I think it's a great pleasure to see our panelists, our alumni who are so passionate about this topic. You have received and probably read the email that I sent today. But, from my perspective, what worries me is that sometimes we don't see the problems that we have just because the school has so many other successes. So we decided to start this equity, diversity, and inclusion task force, to find a better version of ourselves and find a better version of INSEAD and the INSEAD community, and to fight systemic, institutionalized racism where it appears. You've probably seen that we have a plan with a lot of action points. The new INSEAD Office for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion that will be reporting directly to me, because I do think that this is something that we need to look very carefully at. I think that it's also very important that we also train our staff, our faculty, in terms of recognizing discrimination, recognizing racism, because sometimes people say and do things even without recognizing what they're doing. And sometimes they think it's a positive thing when actually it is a negative thing. So we will look at all the ideas of how to improve inclusion and how to improve diversity. Those of you who know me know that in the last 2 years, I have been actually trying to get more and more involved with Africa. So I went to Angola, I went to South Africa, trying to get more students from the continent. We're trying to organize a leadership summit in Nigeria, and we'll do it at some point. I was supposed to be in Rwanda last week. because for us it is important that we, as a business school for the world, we have better representation from that continent as well. I think that it will make us stronger, and hopefully will improve also the outcomes for these countries. So we have a lot of ideas. We have a lot of projects. You have seen in the email that I sent today, all of these items. I just hope that, you know, as always, we recognize that INSEAD is a joint project, and you can help us solve this issue as well. I think that if we get better in terms of equity, inclusion, diversity, I think that the world will be a better place. So again, I want to thank all of you for participating in this seminar, in this webinar, and I want to thank Vinica for moderating it, and Marlon, Felicia, Zoe, Emmett for participating. And it's just the beginning. So I hope that, you know, we can share this path together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ilian. So we need to work together to create a better version of INSEAD, as you said. And I think, I'm sure it means a lot to all of us in the INSEAD community to hear about the impactful actions that you, mentioned in your closing address. So thank you very much for that. And with that, we come to the end of this webinar. A big thank you to all of you once again, to our speakers and our audience. And if I can quickly show the last slide, please, so that we can share with our audience the other webinars that are coming up soon. We have another conversation on this subject of systemic racism, which is being put together by the NAA in Singapore. That's on August 27th. And we have the last in the Summer Learning Festival series on the last, I think, in the conversation with business and society, very important seminar on August 29th on the topic of sustainable food and land use. With that, a big thank you to you all for joining us, and see you next time.